All right, I think we're ready to begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Akshay Surendra. I'm a PhD student at the School of the Environment. We'd like to remind everyone again to keep your microphones muted, but try and keep your videos on. We're very happy to have Dr. Sunita Narain with us today, our keynote speaker. Dr. Sunita Narain is a Delhi-based environmentalist and author, currently the Director General of the Center for Science and Environment and the editor of the fortnightly magazine Down to Earth. Dr. Narain plays an active role in policy formulation on issues of environment and development, both in India and globally. Her work on air pollution, water and waste management, as well as industrial pollution, has led to an understanding of the need for affordable and sustainable solutions in countries like India, where the challenge is to ensure inclusive but sustainable growth. She's been awarded the Padma Shri, which is the fourth highest civilian award in India. And in 2005, the Center for Science and Environment, under her leadership, also won the Stockholm Water Prize. In 2016, Time magazine selected her as one of the most influential people in the world. Today's talk is titled Opportunities and Ways Ahead, Reimagining the Future of Tropical Forests for Livelihood and Environmental Security in a Climate Risk World. Welcome, Dr. Sunita Narayan. It's a great honor to have you with us. Um, for the next 45 minutes, Dr. Narayan will speak, after which we'll have a short 15 to 20-minute question answer session. As a reminder, we're recording this session and we're sharing it on our YouTube channel. The link to the channel will be shared on the chat. Also, Heather Martinez is here for the third year with ISTF, who will be visually recording the keynote session, and her work will be posted on the conference webpage for you to check it out later on. We encourage you all to ask questions in response to Dr. Narayan's talk as and when they arise. You can type it out in the chat box. Kindly provide your name and affiliation and pronouns along with your question. But also, we will request you, people who have both answered in chat and people who have questions later on, to raise your hand and ask questions in person so we can maintain a sort of lively atmosphere. So whether you ask your ask your question by chat or verbally, again, we request you to mention your affiliation and name. Uh, Finally, if you want us to ask a question on your behalf, please let us know as well. And finally, we request you again to keep your microphones muted and your videos on. So welcome, Dr. Sunita Narain. You have the virtual floor.
Thank you, Akshay, and thank you, Akshay. Both of you were in touch with me and had asked me to do this keynote. I'm really privileged. I'm happy to be with you. I was particularly interested when you asked me because I do think that the conversation on forestry and foresters is missing today as much as, and we need to sort of bring it back into the global stage. I'm an environmentalist, as all of you know, but I'm also old. So I started my work in the 80s in India. And in the 80s in India, when environment was discussed, actually forest was on the top of the agenda. And the whole issue of environment was centered around both um, deforestation, but also the question of how we will grow trees. And as an environmentalist based in the South, I find that uh, the issue of forests has somehow lost the primary space that it needs to have in global and national discourse. And that is why when you asked me to speak to you, I thought I would use this as an opportunity to again sort of argue for the repositioning of both forestry, but also the nature of how we will do forest management and the purpose of forest management in our increasingly climate risk world, but also in our world where the poor are only getting poorer. And so it's a question of equity, it's a question of inclusive growth, it's a question of well being of large numbers of people, and it is also about the global challenge of climate change. So that's what I want to talk about this evening for me, morning for you. So, Akshay, is it okay if I now share my screen and then I can go ahead? Good. So, my introduction was really to give you the sense of what I want to talk about and why I want to talk about it more than anything else. Um, if you think about it, in Rio 1992, there were four top items on the agenda. There was climate change, there was biodiversity conservation, there was the talk about a forest convention, something I did not agree with then or now, but yet forest was on the agenda. And of course, the whole issue of desertification was on the agenda. And if you look at desertification, it was linked very much to the question of land management and to the question of how commodity prices in large parts of the world are actually jeopardizing are jeopardizing our land and water management. If from Rio 1992, and we are now going to be close to 2022. So the journey it's been many years, but I believe we have lost a lot of time and these agendas are back with a vengeance. And what we need to now start discussing much more clearly than we did in 1992 is just how interlinked and interconnected these agendas are. We need to talk about how climate change, biodiversity, forests, and desertification are all linked to the way we do land and water management. They are both the threat, but they are also the opportunity on how we can fix things for our future. So the world in 2021, when we sit today, even though the disruption of COVID has completely changed the way we understand the word disruption, but the fact is climate change is beginning to show its really strong impacts. It's happening. We are seeing it from the increasing intensity of hurricanes, tropical cyclones, extreme rains, extreme heat. We are seeing the world going from one weird weather crisis to another. What we need to talk about is that it's about the management of land and water, which is at risk. And the fact is that when I look at it from my part of the world, my own country, when I look at every such event that happens, whether it is the recent event that has happened in the high Himalayas, where we had a flash flood and lives have been lost and a huge amount of damage has happened. It's because of the mismanagement of the human mismanagement of land and water resources, which is being exacerbated by weird weather events. And this is very important for me to emphasize and for us to keep talking about, because often we de-link climate change from what we are doing to the land and water in our own, what we can control. So if you look at the Chamoli flood that happened last week or 10 days ago, it's very much to do with the way we are doing road building or hydropower development in the high Himalayas. It's making the Himalayas even more vulnerable. And this is the world's youngest mountain range. It is the world's mountain range which is already prone to erosion, to landslides. And the development we are doing without any cognizance of this vulnerability is today making it, is letting climate change exacerbate that further. And we saw in the Chamoli disaster that climate change, because of climate change, you are beginning to see more and more glacier melt. And that then led to this particular event. Now, all this also we need to put a human face to it. The fact is that this is making millions in our world, across Africa, across Asia, more vulnerable, more marginalized. And at the end of the day, it's making the world more insecure. And this is why it's important for us, as we talk about climate change, to put forests, the management of land and water, at the core of the livelihood and resilience agenda. I'll give you one instance that happened a few years ago not very long ago, in 2018, we had this huge numbers of dust storms that hit northern India. 50 dust storms in a matter of 15 to 20 days, killed over 500, destroyed homes and crops. And as we started understanding those dust storms, you understood the local and global connections and the whole question about the local environment connected to the global changes. So, in the dust storms, and this is across all other such events, I'm just taking this as an instance. The first thing we found was that the Western disturbance is this whole wind pattern that brings winds to northern parts of South Asia. This is changing, the pattern is changing, it's getting longer. And this in turn is linked to a weakened Arctic jet stream. Warmer Arctic, uh, changing difference between the temperature between the oceans is now making the Western disturbance more and more variable. At the same time, the Bay of Bengal is getting warmer, more cyclones, more heavy rain. And in this particular instance, what happened was that you had the Western disturbance, freak, longer, Bay of Bengal, more cyclones, a collision, huge impact, and leading to dust storms. But that was not all. It was also about the intense heat spikes that were happening at that time in Pakistan, North India, which is making the ground even drier. Moisture is getting lost because of this intense heat that we are seeing. It's combined with the groundwater overuse, which in turn is making the soil even less full of moisture, and deforestation. So it's a combination of all this. And that's really what the story is, that we need to be able to link this to the forest, the water, the groundwater use. We can't anymore think in terms of silos, in terms of, oh, I care about forest. I really don't understand groundwater use, but it has an impact. I care about forests. I don't think about livestock, but livestock and meat and food has a complete link to forests as well. So, what you learn from each one of these events is just how interconnected the world is, both in terms of the local developments as well as global. And that's really an important lesson for us as professionals, that we need to be able to see it. This is just a chart which just shows you those impacts as they happened. Now, simultaneously, we are seeing in our part of the world, and this is something that is becoming more and more evident, that as climate change happens, we will see more rain in fewer number of rainy days. So more extreme rain events are going to happen in our world. Now, what does rain event mean? I mean, in the first 12 days of August, we got 1,000 extreme rain events. And as a result of it, what you got was more rain in fewer number of rainy days, which then leads to floods and droughts. Because water flows away, is not captured or harvested, leads to droughts, impacts farmers who are already struggling for subsistence, impacts water supply, of course, of cities, adds to conflict between cities and farmers on the use of water. But the point that we need to remember is it is about the management of land. I mean, the one thing that I struggle to explain again and again, something that is, I think, so basic, is the fact that the catchments of our water bodies are our forests. And that the link to water and forests is critical. The map of India shows us very clearly that where the forests of India are is where the water comes from. But that's only the larger picture. If you look at any water body, it is linked to forests. And that linkage in this climate risk time, when you will see more extreme rain events, and therefore the ability to be able to hold the water where it falls becomes even more critical. And that then becomes the agenda in terms of both water and forests. And the reason we need to worry about this is that these floods, droughts, any one of these disasters, which you cannot anymore call a natural disasters, they cripple people, they destroy livelihoods, they take away the development dividend. Every time we have a tropical cyclone, the one good thing that we have is that we have improved our forecasting abilities so that people don't die. That is good. But the fact is, it takes away years of investment that is made to secure livelihoods of people. And as these events become more frequent, survival becomes more difficult. And people have then no option to move, to migrate to cities, to new countries. And this is where the whole migration agenda, the displacement agenda, needs to be linked as well. And if you will see all the data that exists today, you will find today the migration is all about new displacement, new causes of displacement. And this is not to say they only leave the country. It's about leaving from village to city. And the fact is, this then makes the management of our cities even more difficult. But as I said, it's not about climate change, it's about our mismanagement. And climate change is exacerbating impacts. I know this may not be so relevant to parts of the northern world, but I say this continuously in India, because often our leaders tend to be able to blame it on climate change so that it becomes something that we don't do to fix our current problem. And that's really something that we must never slip into. But the point is, we are running out of time. We are seriously running out of time. I began with talking about the 1992 agenda. I was in Rio at that time. And at that time, I keep calling it the time when the world was so innocent, when we believed that this agenda was something that we could work on. And somehow we have missed the boat. And I think we've missed it because we didn't look at the interconnectedness of the agenda, and we didn't root it in the lives of the poorest in the world and look at how we can start with fixing their livelihoods before we did anything else. And this then is today the 2021 agenda. Land and forests are a global issue, not only because the impacts of climate change are impacting land, forests, water, and the lives of people, which I talked about, but also because land, forests, and water management will provide us a way to cope with climate change and build livelihoods. It's part of the development agenda, it's part of the resilience agenda of the world. But also because land and water management will provide us ways to mitigate emissions, combat climate change. So in some senses, we've come a full cycle. We've come back to the agenda to say, here is the possibility, and that's what your entire conference is about. Here is how you can turn this crisis into the opportunity going forward. And so it's not just about deforestation, but about fighting deforestation. This is the opportunity. We know that soil is a repository of carbon, forests sequester and hold carbon, grasslands hold carbon. These are the world's natural sinks. And if we grow them, we can mitigate and combat climate change. But, and this is the repositioning, reimagining of this agenda, we cannot do this without securing rights of people to land and forests. Our forests in our world are habitats of people. Our forests are not wilderness. And I want to underline this because we have in many parts of the now emerging world, as we call ourselves, we have inherited conservation ethos, a management practice, which has tended to look at forests as wilderness. Now, that may be true in large parts of the US, large parts of Australia, maybe, but it is not true in our world. Our world, our forests are the habitats of people, and animals. And the third thing that we need to understand is that people are the best managers of forests. They are the growers of trees. And this then becomes the restoration agenda, the livelihoods from trees. It's also the agenda that we cannot do this without changing the way we do agriculture so that we do not over chemicalize our soils. And this then links to the changing of diets. Because at the end of the day, we also know that the forest agenda is linked to the land agenda. I mean, in India, we have this huge conversation of the role of livestock and meat. And for me, Indian agriculture is a system of agro-silvo-pastoral system, a system where farmers keep cattle, individual farmers keep individual cattle, and that cattle has a critical role to play in soil fertility. But that livestock also has a major impact on the forests. So it is the balancing of that that we can actually talk about. And that's where we also need to link it to the question of food. Because at the end of the day, the question of how much meat we eat and how we grow that meat becomes a critical part of the future agenda. But I want to come back to forests and to conservation. I can get lost in the food agenda forever. And this is where we need to learn the lessons of the past decade of conservation without people. If you look at the way we have done forest management, and I know India, I know some part of South Asia, so I'm going to speak from my experience, and you will have to draw onto it to see whether it's relevant in other ecosystems and other politics and other political scenarios as well. But definitely in our part of the world, our forest management practices have swung a pendulum. They have gone from extraction. So in the 80s, the question of forests was really about how quickly could we cut down the forests for use for timber, for use for paper industry, essentially extraction. But for extraction, you had large state private control of areas, which was supposedly for productive use and for large scale extraction. Now that had major environmental impact, and there was a huge focus on the need to control deforestation. So we swung a pendulum. We went from extraction to protection. And we went to the point where growing trees has become a crime in large parts because forest land is today protected and managed by the forest department for good reasons, to say that here is a protection agenda. It's a conservation agenda. We need to protect this, because if we start doing utilization of this, then we will move towards either unsustainable utilization or vast extraction, or that we will not be able to manage it because we will allow people in, and they are the biotic pressure on our forests. And in all cases, therefore, people get excluded. Now, this works where density is low, where people are rich, where, where forests have already been converted from large areas of forests to plantations, where wildernesses have been protected more as large sanctuaries and fenced off. But we can't do so. Our people live in these forests, and our imperatives, therefore, are very different. As I said, forests are habitats, not wilderness. Millions depend on forests for livelihood. They are also the survival base of the poorest. And therefore, the management and use will demand cooperation. Exclusion cannot and will not work. And the agenda, therefore, becomes how to secure interests of poor with interests of forests, how to secure the interests of conservation with development. And these then becomes the three interconnected challenges: how to increase forest production, increase use of forest material in the new economy, and increase productivity of forests. I mean, as an environmentalist, I often feel very alone when I talk in India today about a wood-based economy. I would like to see more wood to be used. And every time I say this, I get huge stares for people saying, how can you as an environmentalist talk about wood-based economy? How can you talk about increasing the use of wood, making houses made of wood and bamboo? Why would you want to do that? We need to conserve our forests. But I think the biggest agenda today for a country like India, where land is scarce, where we have 33% uh, uh, um, uh, of our 22% of our land is under forest. We need to make sure that that agenda is about productivity as well, because otherwise what we are finding today is that the forests are becoming unproductive agenda, and therefore we will slip into being seeing the forests as wastelands, as land that is available for every development use, and we will slowly see forests protected only in those wilderness areas that we call in the Western conservation ethos. But the second part of this agenda is, how do you increase this productivity where forests have competing needs from poor people and livestock? And this is a very tough agenda. This is a really tough agenda, because at the end of the day, every time the foresters talk about how we can actually build uh, forests, they recognize, they have to recognize the fact that they have just outside their forests very poor people and their livestock. And livestock, we know, does destroy the regeneration in the forests. And poor people need forests for their existence, for their survival needs. And therefore, it becomes, how do you increase this productivity, include people in it, and yet make sure that you can get regeneration? And the third part, of course, is, how do you increase this productivity to build an inclusive and equitable growth? And I want to say this particularly because I talked about earlier the climate agenda, the climate risks, the impact on land and water, the increased need for building resilience of local economies. But it's also at some level about that inclusive growth that we know is critical in our world, because without that, we will never be able to have sustainable growth. You know, I was asked by the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister of India, Dr. Manmohan Singh, to lead a task force to look at the how to manage tigers in India. And I will, and when I gave him the report, the one thing that I spoke to him and to the government was that you really need to look at this map of India. If you look at this map of India, the forests of India, and that's in gray, and you will see these here, are also where the tigers live, and you can see the dots. But these are also where the poorest people live in India. These are the 150 poorest districts of India. And so the poor live in our richest lands. These are also the lands, as I said, from where our waters come. They're also the land where the minerals are. And so we have to relearn development. We have to relearn conservation because of this. And this was the report that I gave. This is a long time ago. Many of you would not even have heard of it. It was in 2005 when the last tiger was seen in Sariska. And the Prime Minister then said, I need an agenda on how to move ahead. And our report said, join the dots. And this was the report where we brought out both the poverty agenda and the coexistence agenda for conservation. And the argument and what we said in the report was that the protection of wild animals and tigers was happening today in India against all odds. On one hand, there were under threat from outside pressures, mining, hydroelectric power, roads, but they're also under siege from within, people who have been denied the benefits of conservation. So this is a war. It's a war of conservation, and we are losing it bit by bit. And if you look at this map of Sariska, which we put out, we said, this is the forest of Sariska. And if you look at all the corridors that led out, that's where the forests were. But today it's a double jeopardy. The tiger can't move out because the forests have been destroyed, settlements have come in, people are angry because they have been denied the benefits of conservation. But bit by bit, people are moving in as well as development is coming in. And so we recommended a three-prong approach. One, we said expand the inviolate spaces for tigers. So yes, we recognize that there is some part of conservation where you will have to minimize human pressure. So recognize that and expand the inviolate spaces. But do that again by making sure, because there were vast numbers of people that still live in these inviolate spaces, if you need to relocate them, give them the benefits of conservation, share the benefits of tourism with them, give them land, make them better off rather than worse off. And in that, repair the relationship with people who share the tiger's habitat by building strategies for coexistence, invest in people's livelihoods, give them the benefits of conservation. And simultaneously, the third part of the agenda was regenerate the forest habitats in the fringes of protective enclaves by investing in forest, water, grassland economies of the people. Give them the benefits of of forest management. And I don't know how relevant this is in other parts of the world, but one of the most interesting and the most fascinating questions I was involved with over these last some years has been the very definition of something called bamboo. Is bamboo a tree or a timber, or grass or a tree? If it's a grass, then people can grow it, cut, transport, and build a green economy. But if it's a tree, under the law, only the government can grow, cut, and transport. And so I go back to that earlier challenge that I raised, the challenge where we talked about that we need to find a way that we can increase the productivity of our land, but we need to do that by involving people, because people, if we don't involve people in growing the trees, cutting the trees, then we will never be able to secure and regenerate the land. And this became one of the most interesting questions over the last few years. Finally, the government agreed that bamboo is a grass to some extent. It's still a gray area, but increasingly the question is, how do you make sure that people can actually grow it, transport it, and build a green economy? So as we said, forests are central to the future. I talked about this. I want to get back to this. They play a role in sequestering carbon. We've already talked about how we can reinvent the growth, but I want to emphasize now how all countries are talking about, I don't agree on net zero plans. Everybody is under pressure to come up with a grand announcement for 2050, and most countries are saying they're going to do a net zero by 2050. But start looking into the details of those plans, and you will find that a lot of the very word net zero means that you will emit, but you will clean up the carbon dioxide. Now, you can do that through fancy CCS technology, or you could do that by building on natural sinks. And when you look at the details, you will find that natural sinks, or what is today being called more, in the more genteel world, nature-based solutions are being pushed very hard as the answer for climate change. And the reason why this is done, and this is an old McKinsey chart, I don't normally use McKinsey data, but I will use it for the moment, is it's an old chart, but it helps to explain the cost of cutting emissions. And you will see here, everything that is the cheapest cost has to do with soil restoration, grassland management, agriculture conversion, removing slash and burn, of course, and then, of course, forest management. This is the cheapest cost that is seen in the world. And this is why countries in the world are increasingly talking about net zero and nature-based solutions, because they see this is the opportunity of being able to deal with climate change. But the point is that REDD and these fancy words of REDD, REDD plus, will only work if we accept that our forests are habitats and not carbon sinks or sticks. And if the world stops looking for cheap and easy answers. Forests are not cheap offsets. We need to be able to place the agenda of people in this. Forests are an opportunity to address underlying problems of current economies. They are an opportunity to build local economies of people, build resilience, build new futures. They are not about cheap offsets. And if we do this, this is the opportunity. But from everything we've talked about earlier, we need to put people at the center of it. So this then becomes the real opportunity to use the agenda to mitigate not just emissions, but also to eliminate poverty, build livelihoods of people from growing trees, cutting them and growing them again, make forest-based economies part of the future, but make it part of also the livelihood of people from growing trees, food that is local, biodiverse, and nutritious, which is part of the agenda of land and water. So this then is what I wanted to say to you. Thank you very much. I hope it was useful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Narain. This was an amazing talk and lots of food for thought. I think we're opening the floor for questions. So we have a few in the chat. I think our first question was from Mustafa. Would you like to unmute and ask your question, Mustafa Jafri? I can read out the question for you. Yeah. Mustafa Jafri asks, thanks, Sunita. Sorry, go ahead.
Is clear?
Yes, Mustafa.
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for very good presentation. Just I wanted to ask, or I cannot hear. Your sound is not good.
We can hear you, Mustafa. So please go ahead with your question.
Okay. No, just I want to say, if we want to have a sustainable forest management, we shouldn't lay on the forest production just. Because if we live according to the production of the forest and the people production, I think we challenge for sustainability of the management of the ecosystem. So we need to have goods and services, others, so it can be included in our work. Anyway, if we want to lay our people on the wood production, we may challenging for other aspects like climate change, which we are all day-to-day facing with the deforestation issue. The other question, forest production, just, or I want to raise, and the people livelihood. How Sunita can explain me, how do you prove the relation and linkage between climate change and sandstorm? Because it's very important to have scientifically approving this linkage, because I'm working in IPCC as a lead author in Asia chapter. So, and I'm working on the dust storm, which is related to climate change. We work in other part of the Asia. But I want to share Sunita experience in this regard. Thank you. And sorry for taking a bit long. Is it okay?
Yeah, should I answer that, Akshay?
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Narain. Yeah.
So, Mustafa, thank you very much. I think you've raised the most fundamental issue.
Which is really Sunita experience in this regard. Thank you. And sorry for taking it.
Yeah. So, Mustafa, I think you raised a very critical issue. That's really what I'm challenging, that this whole concept of just look at services of forests and not the productivity of forests has really meant that the role of forests has got misplaced in our economies. And this is my point. You may not agree with it, that's up to you. But I feel strongly that as an environmentalist, we have done disservice to the question of forestry by focusing only on the services of forests. And so we have these valuations of forests done on the oxygen, on the water retention capacities, on the ecosystem capacities of forests, on biodiversity, all very important. Please don't get me wrong. But we also equally need to talk about the productivity of forests. We need to talk about growing trees, cutting them, and building forest-based economies. And this is why it's important for us, when I look at India, and I'm sure the question, it'll be similar in other parts of the world, we need to look at it in terms of where the forests are, what the ecological purpose of that forest is, and therefore what's the reason for which we are going to protect it. Let's say we have very diverse, ecologically diverse forests. We need to protect them because of the intrinsic ecosystem value of those forests. But then we need to start talking about how do we pay the true cost of protecting the forest as forests, and not just talk about the cost, but who the money goes to. Because right now we have in India, we've had these payments that are being made to the state governments for retaining forests as forests. But these are going to governments. They need to go to communities, because at the end of the day, it is in the backyard of the community that that forest is being retained as a forest for the ecosystem value, for the water productivity value, for all the other intangible values that we strongly believe in, and we know that they exist. But we also need to start talking about how do we put forests back into the local economies of people. And that's the missing puzzle. And I find that very strange because, you know, I speak often, and I love to speak to them, is the forest. So we have something called the Indian Forest Service. And there are there are officers at different level who come, and I speak to them both when they are probationers as well as later. And the biggest pushback I get, and I can hear it also from in Mustafa's question, the biggest pushback I get is, why are you talking about a forest-based economy? We don't want to grow our forests anymore for trees. We want to grow our forests for the other services that forests give. And I really think, and that's my argument to all of you, I think we need to recenter that debate. We have swung that pendulum too much, and we need to recenter it. And it doesn't mean one or the other, it means both. And that's the point I'm making. And that's something that I seriously believe needs to be done. Otherwise, we will lose all our forests, because slowly countries and governments will say, this is unproductive use. And if you can't prove the tangible value for it, we will protect a bit of it. It's a nice thing to do. We'll protect some wilderness area, but the rest of it will go. Now, the second point that Mustafa raised was about dust storms and the link to climate change. Mustafa, I explained in my graph, we have done a lot of work. And I think if you go to our website, it's called downtoearth.org.in, you will see we have done a very detailed investigation and cover story on this. Essentially, the links that are coming both in terms of the increasing cyclonic activity from the Bay of Bengal, because of the changes, the difference in changing temperatures between the land and the sea, as well as the changes in the jet stream that is happening. And that, because of the Mediterranean system being so linked to the South Asian system, something we don't understand, how globalized the winds are, how globalized the monsoon is. I mean, so the jet stream, the Mediterranean Ocean, and that linkage with the Western disturbances is what then led to the dust storms. But as I explained, Mustafa, climate change exacerbates the impacts. The human beings in our part of the world intensify the impacts of dust storms because of our overuse of groundwater, because of the lack of green cover that we have, because of the intense heat that we have. So that's really what it is. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Narain. We have a comment from 3T Vakil of Sustainable Forestry in Puerto Rico. Sorry if I pronounced it wrong. 3T, do you want to unmute yourself and clarify your comment? Yeah.
Yeah, just Sunita, thank you very much. That was a very inspiring talk. I deal with wood and I'm dealing with growing trees in Puerto Rico. And I fully agree that lands that have been used agriculturally, that are lying there, perhaps with some seedlings coming up, which is very difficult in the tropics for hardwood trees to grow in full sunlight. I think trees need to be planted, valuable wood needs to be planted. And to create a value for those lands is a really under the carpet kind of thing, which affects everything. If we leave those lands to be seen as wastelands, which in the main they are, if they don't have trees on them, then they have scrub, then people dump trash, then it becomes it's an ongoing exacerbated problem. And on a small island like Puerto Rico, a lot of land in the lower parts near the sea, near the oceans, when the big rains come, and they are, like you said, the amount of rainfall is increasing. So I really agree with you that we have to make make forests productive and to plant trees for wood and for any other forest products that we can. And we have to really move into that kind of way of thinking. So I really appreciate your comments. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another comment by Geraldo Junior Fernandez. Do you want to unmute and share your thoughts? Alternatively, I could read it out. So he writes, I agree with Dr. Narain that forests are, first of all, habitat for humans and animals alike, and that there lies a lot of opportunities to improve the well-being of the forests and the well-being of people and other living beings that live therein.
Yeah. I mean, Akshay, that's not a comment. It's a comment, and I think we are all. I think the question that I can see here is from Sarita, which is again going back to the whole question about productivity, plantations versus biodiverse forests and NTFP, non-timber forest produce. And I think, I really think we need to move out of these silos. Plantations are not bad, but on what land are the plantations coming up? Who will the revenue of plantations go to? Those are what we need to discuss. NTFP is very important. That is a produce of the forests. Again, the question is, how do we maximize on the produce of the forest? How do you make sure that that goes into the hands of people? So I think again, I'm going to come back to this, Akshay, to say, forests are about people and about livelihoods. And I want to emphasize that. Once you do that, then a lot of these other questions get answered as well.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, this is Sarita. I just want to say that I agree with that point. It's like, it was not, my comment was, okay. I meant more that we don't need to focus only on production, We want to see the forest as an ecosystem where it's more like going to the traditional knowledge way where humans and nature are connected, and forest is our livelihood. So we protect as we protecting ourselves. So it's two ways more than focusing on the westernized idea of forest for production or for, yeah, so I agree with the idea. I was misunderstood.
No, sorry, Sarita. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, Dr. Narain, we have a question. We have a question from Radhika Sundaresan. Radhika, go ahead.
Thanks, Akshay. First of all, thank you for the talk today, Sunita. I thought it really connected me back to the days of India. So I have a question about the growth of conservation finance. I really like how you brought the link between forests and people and habitat, which I think is lacking a bit in the West. But what are your thoughts on using financial instruments like green bonds and insurance mechanisms through which private capital is entering forest management? So then forest management becomes about financial returns and social returns. I just wanted to know, is that seeping into India as well? And what are your thoughts on that if you wanted to move away from the state government management?
Radhika, honestly, I don't know much about it. I only know that we looked at some experiences with RED and RED Plus in Africa. And what I found there was that, as I mentioned in my talk, the trouble with private finance is that it doesn't put people at the center of it, okay, and is looking for cheapest options. If it's driven from the purpose of cheapest option, what you saw in what our studies from Africa have shown is that those are essentially using forests as carbon sticks. And we want to grow the forest because it helps to sequester, and then I can call, I mean, I was seeing recently people are now calling oil as net zero oil. I mean, it's an oxymoron. I mean, how do you call oil as net zero? But that's I'm growing some trees in Africa and I'm sort of sequestering carbon and I'm calling my oil as net zero. Now, I think that's the problem with private finance. And therefore, I'm old fashioned in this. I believe that private finance needs societal values and we need governance to be set up, regulatory instruments. We need to determine what is private finance going to be used for. I'm not against private finance. I just think unbridled private finance in the name of free capitalism and free markets has got us where we are today. So if anyone tells me this today, in today's world, that this is all okay, when you're looking at the growth of, mega capitalists and you're looking at a world at the brink of increased inequity and a survival threat, and you tell me today that, let's give private capital the free hand, then I really think we're in different planets.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Narain. I think I'd like to pick on this point that you just mentioned and delve into this a little deeper and ask a question about some recent work that Down to Earth has been doing. And I think it would be amiss to have a conversation at ISTF this year without talking about the pandemic. And what we observed is the pandemic has created a lot of demand for traditional medicine, things like honey. And the expectation is these things would actually cause trickle down to marginal collectors of forest produce and secure their livelihoods. But that's not what has happened. Of large scale investigation both within India and across the world from your organization, which you termed Honeygate, has found that at least in India, 3/4 of the honey is not honey at all. It's just fructose. And when you speak to local honey collectors, you've realized that they're not able to compete with the falling prices because of this. So in this particular example, and then scaling up from there, how do you think can avoid falling into this trap of, okay, there is incentive to take financial instruments to local communities, but the mechanisms are failing?
See, Akshay, it's really about markets. It's about what Radhika asked. I mean, you leave the market and say, oh, we all need honey and let the market produce the honey and sell it and brand it and put a price to it that as cheap as possible, because we as consumers want to believe that we can get the world's best produce very cheap. Now, that's what companies have done. And in India, when we did this Honeygate investigation, we basically found that they were able to bypass the Indian regulations for safety by mixing sugar syrup, which has been designed or modified and coming from China and now also being manufactured in India, to actually beat the standards. Now, and our investigation began because we started hearing from honey beekeepers that they were not getting a value for their produce. So we went out and looked at it, and that's when we found the scandal. But the interesting thing, Akshay, is, and I think that's where the good news is, when we did this study and this expose, and obviously they're the biggest brands and they're massive and they're powerful and they're doing everything they can to prove that we are wrong. But on the other hand, what has happened is now that we talked about how they need to, how you get honey from tribal communities and how forest-based honey is obviously one of the best. And today, these big brands are now talking about how they're sourcing honey from forest-based communities and things. Now the question becomes, how do you make sure that people benefit from it? That these forest-based communities have a certain bargaining power, that can also make sure that their honey doesn't get adulterated on the way and then get sold as sugar syrup and anything else. So, I mean, that's all part of the design of the market. And I believe very strongly that today's market design has to be one where you have much more local produce. And you also have to have consumers who are much more aware. And that one of the biggest things will be how we actually end up with paying a certain price to it, and also being able to understand where is it being produced, who is producing it. I mean, I can see behind you some beautiful forest picture, and I can see an elephant, and I can see that's probably somewhere in the Western Ghats. Now, that's where a lot of the honey would also come from. But today, honey actually in the forests of India is seen as a forest produce. And other than allowing a certain allowed amount of honey for bona fide use, forest communities have a really tough time in being able to harvest it. And that's the whole question about NTFPs. That's the whole question of the value of forests. How do you increase it? How do you put money in the hands of communities? How do you make sure that the food we eat is actually one which is both good for livelihoods and also good for our nutrition? Those are the questions.
Thank you so much. I think we're almost out of time, but we have time for maybe one last question. If anyone has a question, could you unmute and ask?
I can see this question from Geraldo, which is in Philippines. They make use of forests for hunting, and if local communities, that's really the point, Geraldo. I think that's the point that I mentioned, that sustainable, how do you define sustainable use where hunting is allowed? I mean, hunting is part of our traditions. Today, we have such a massive problem of wild animals and human conflict, massive problem. And we are not recognizing that conflict at all, because we have kind of closed our minds to be able to understand how do we resolve it. And that again has to do with both the carrying capacity of the land, the forests, and also the practices that we had for being able to do some amount of sustainable culling. Now, it's a bad word in our lexicon, but it's something to discuss, something to talk about, as long as the money goes into the hands of people. And as long as you can do it with knowing that it's within, how do you define sustainability? So I think that's really what, sorry, Akshay, I just wanted to jump in on that.
No worries, thank you. I think we have a last question from Dr. Martinini. Can you go ahead?
Yes, thank you very much, Sunita. I agree so much with everything you have said. And Mainly a couple of last remarks, because sometimes it's in the final remarks when you say everything you want to say, because you get like a little bit more passionate about it because you're about to close. So I think I really agree with two of your comments at the end, that forests, we need to see them for what they are, the forests, and not for just a repository of wood and other things, not timber forest products and all that. And I also agree a lot with what you say about private finance. There is a big trend today of big enterprises and businesses that want to have their green side of them by planting trees in the tropics, carbon offsets, and then they do disastrous things like planting eucalypts in areas of tropical land that where they shouldn't be, and they are not well advised. So we need to do what you say, advise those companies so what they do environmentally speaking is well done. My work is mostly in Latin America, and I have seen examples of what I'm telling you, those carbon offsets all over the place, in Costa Rica, in Peru, in my home country of Argentina. It's like they make me cry sometimes when I see they have cut forests sometimes to plant eucalypts for their carbon offsets, and they are advised by local people who are young and they don't have money, so they are very willing to have those jobs, and they say, oh, I'm a forester, I'm advising this company, and it's they're doing their thing and all that. But definitely we need to do that, and to see the forest as a habitat for animals, for people, for whatever, and all the functions that they provide to us. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very inspiring.
Thank you, Florencia. Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't introduce myself. I'm a senior research scientist at the School of the Environment, working on agroforestry, restoration, and a few other things in Latin America and other parts of the world. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
All right, I think we'll have to call it wraps, but if you have questions, I'm sure you can reach out to Dr. Narain. I'd like to offer thanks to Dr. Sunita Narain on behalf of the student organizing team for making the time to give us this wonderful talk. There's so many takeaways, so many things to think about, and the primarily importance between the local and the global, and the importance of people, which I think you wrote 23 years ago, that what remains completely missing in response to the Rio conference is the concern for the human being, and that still remains today. So thank you, Dr. Narain.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
So we'll now be transitioning to a panel called Data Plus, reframing the role of data in addressing environmental challenges, and we will have 4 speakers presenting on this topic. It's bound to be very exciting. The Zoom link will be pasted in the chat below and also on your login webpage. It'll start in 15 minutes at 9:45 EST. So hope to see you all there. Thank you.